In 2015, the number of substantiated child abuse or neglect cases in Kentucky numbered about 13,000. That's correct, 13,000. Some of them were fatal. Dr. Melissa Currie is a UofL pediatrician who specializes in forensic medicine and also has a contract with the state to evaluate children who are suspected victims of child abuse. Welcome, Dr. Currie.
Thank you for having me.
How you good? How you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
All right, I just quoted this 2015 study because I couldn't find the 2016 one, but you have that in front of you. So just kind of give us an overview of what we're talking about in terms of child abuse cases in the state of Kentucky.
We have a significant problem with child abuse here in Kentucky, child physical abuse and neglect in particular. That largely seems to be a function of the explosion of the opioid epidemic, at least currently. As we've seen heroin addiction go up, we've seen child abuse go up as well. Kentucky has a longstanding history of being well above the national average in child abuse, in particular as it pertains to fatalities and near fatalities. Actually, back in 2007, we had the highest child fatality rate in the nation. And as of last year, according to national data, we still have the second highest child victimization rate in the country. And we don't fully understand everything that contributes to that, but certainly substance abuse and lack of access to mental health resources seem to be key factors there.
Right. One out of how many kids in Kentucky are abused in some way or neglected?
We don't have that number specifically for Kentucky because it depends on how you define it, but the well-accepted rates that we see nationally are when we ask adults about their histories, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will have experienced some form of maltreatment in their childhood.
Say they were abused when they were children.
Yes,
wow.
and so the rates are huge. And we do know that even when we look at data from Child Protective Services, we know that it is vastly underreported. And I think that's one thing that folks often aren't aware of is when we review these near fatalities and fatalities in the state external review panel, only about half of them were known to the system before this happened. So many times there has been a history of violence in the home, but no one in an official capacity knew about that.
It never got reported.
Exactly.
And there was never a social worker or an investigator that went to that house and investigated.
That's correct.
Okay.
And we actually have been gathering data on bystander issues and have found a disconcerting number of cases where after the fact, folks were willing to share that they had concerns, but did not understand Kentucky's mandated reporting law and had not called that in.
We're talking with Dr. Melissa Currie, who's a UofL pediatrician, specializes in forensic medicine and works with the state on child abuse fatalities and near fatalities. So how many child abuse fatalities and near fatalities were there in 2016 in the state of Kentucky?
We reviewed 142 of them, and there were a few more than that. So I think the final number ended up being something like 148, and there are still some pending cases, so that final number won't be known still for several months. And of those, of those, about 50 of them were fatalities.
So 150 ballpark, fatality or near fatality, a third of those were fatal. So 50 kids died at the hands of child abusers last year.
That's correct.
And what is your role in dealing with those cases?
So at the Kosare Charities Division of Pediatric Forensic Medicine here at University of Louisville, we provide the medical evaluation piece for children who are suspected victims. So we help identify and describe any injuries that the child has or any other ways the child may have suffered as a result of their abuse. So that can include things like emotional abuse and mental health problems as well. We become involved at the very beginning of a case. So at the same time that we are documenting the injuries we know about, we're also ordering tests to make sure that we find all the injuries that are there, because we know that that is one common thing that gets missed, is the injury we see sometimes is not as bad as the injury that we aren't seeing yet.
Right.
And then we are explaining those injuries to investigators so that they understand, for example, why this particular head injury in a 4-month-old is not a result of a fall off the couch, as we maybe are told. And so we're helping to guide the investigators in their investigation while we're trying to help the medical team make sure that they identify everything that's there. And then after that, we go to court and we testify when needed about these injuries and how they might have and couldn't have been caused.
When you see these cases, I don't want to call them typical, or because none of them are typical, obviously, but what are the majority of these cases? Are they head injuries? Are they bones that were broken? What are they? What are the majority of the cases involving child abuse fatalities?
When we're looking at fatalities, by far and away, the most common abusive causes abusive head trauma. It's what we used to call shaken baby syndrome decades ago. The second most dangerous form is abusive abdominal trauma. When you look at the numbers overall, however, we are actually seeing more children die as a result of neglect. And one of the issues that has really come to the surface and is being exacerbated by the substance abuse issues are sleep-related deaths in babies. And what we are seeing through the external review panel is that folks are co-sleeping with their infants, but while they are impaired, while they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And the chances for a poor outcome and for that child to die because of that situation is extremely high.
Is that like a parent who's on drugs and high, falls asleep, kids next to him, and they roll over on the child or something? Is that what you're talking about here?
Yes, and sometimes we don't know for sure if they actually rolled over on the child or did covers just get over the child's face and they rebreathed carbon dioxide and didn't get enough oxygen. There are other components to it that we don't always understand. But what we are seeing is a huge spike in these cases here in Kentucky beyond what we're seeing nationally.
Really? Is that in Jefferson County or is that statewide?
That is statewide.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because I didn't know that. I don't think most people probably did know that. So drugs are having this terrible impact, obviously, on people personally, but also on their kids, it appears.
Absolutely.
Geez, that's tough. We're talking with Dr. Melissa Currie, pediatrician at UofL, who deals with these child abuse cases, and these are some tough conversations to have. The state did, a couple of years ago, set up the Child Fatality Review Panel. How has that made an impact, in your mind, on the investigation and the identification of these child abuse cases?
I think anytime we get multiple disciplines talking to one another in the same room about these cases, kids are only going to win. And we are seeing better cooperation and collaboration between police and child protective services when they're both involved in cases. That was an issue that we continue to see and continue to report about at the panel, is that there are definitely better outcomes to the investigations or from the investigations when the two parties are working together and sharing information and coordinating. CPS certainly has come to the table with open ears, and we have seen adjustments made in policy that as far as where they focus their attention. And they have been welcoming during the meetings to hearing input and ideas for how the very limited resources that they have can be best put to use to help protect these kids.
Is that the biggest problem in the state of Kentucky right now, that there just aren't enough social workers and investigators to look into these child abuse cases quickly? Or is it the lack of reporting from the home?
I think one of the biggest problems is the limitation in CPS to respond because of the resource issue. There certainly are many other issues. And as I said before, half of these cases aren't even known to CPS. And I do think that that's something we sometimes do, is we lay a lot of the responsibility onto CPS when really keeping kids safe is everybody's responsibility. It's, neighbors, bystanders, families and friends, doctors, schools, daycares, etc.
We're talking with Dr. Melissa Currie on UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 on the Ville. And what else would you tell parents and others, loved ones, about how to identify whether a child has been abused? I mean, because you mentioned earlier, it was clear that they didn't fall off the couch to you, but it might not be to me, that I may just see a big bump on a kid's head and say, oh, I buy that. Happened to my kid.
Yes, I think bruising in babies is not normal is probably the single most helpful rule for people to be aware of. Until a child is starting to pull up on furniture and take steps on their own, they don't fall down. It seems intuitive and obvious once you say it that you have to be up before you can fall down. But if you have a baby that is not yet pulling up and walking, that baby shouldn't have bruises at all. And while the explanation may sound very benign for a forehead bruise or a bruise on the cheek or arm or leg or anywhere on a baby, that needs to be reported 100% of the time. And there actually is a fairly extensive medical evaluation that we do on every single baby who presents with a bruise. Because not only could it be inflicted injury, it could be a number of other serious issues. It could be bleeding disorder, heaven forbid, cancer, leukemia, etc.
So you need to have the kid checked out. You need to report it one way or the other.
Absolutely.
Isn't it hard, though, for people, a husband or a wife who looks at the child and says, how'd Beth get that, my baby over here, get that little bruise? Isn't it hard to think that your husband or your spouse might have done something and report them?
I think it's incredibly difficult, and I'm grateful I've never been in that situation, and I don't pretend to understand how difficult that would be. I think that for most of us as adults, though, we recognize that the babies need us to stand up for them. They can't protect themselves, so we have to make the tough decisions and make the tough calls. And honestly, in most of the situations that we see, there is a history of, if not overt violence, then at least a short temper, an explosive temper on the part of the caregiver, depression, a recent change in personality, or if we are honest, there often are other issues that are there and that people are aware of.
What percentage of these child abuse cases are family related? In other words, it's a father, grandfather, stepbrother, something like that.
The vast majority of them.
90% or
yes.
more?
Yes. If we take out sexual abuse, I would say it's closer to about 75%.
Wow. Yeah. And is there any case that you have found in your experience that was particularly heartbreaking or that got a lot of attention in Kentucky that you just said, this should never have happened?
There are more of them
than you can count, I'm sure,
than
in the
I
work
can
you're
count. The one that I'm preparing for right now actually is a Southern Indiana case, and there were multiple missed opportunities to help protect this 3-year-old girl who was ultimately murdered, and it was difficult to read both because of the severity of the injuries, but also because of how many different people saw bruising on this child and her sister and did not report it.
Neighbors, doctors, who? Teachers?
Neighbors, primarily family members in the home, grandparents in the home, and other family members and friends coming in and out of the home.
Okay. So what would be your advice to folks in that situation?
Have a healthy dose of skepticism. Ask questions when we see injuries on children, and if we have any doubts at all, that needs to be reported.
Last question. For the state of Kentucky, it has made some changes with the Child Fatality Review Board and some other things. How would you rate, in terms of a letter grade, maybe A, B, C, or D, or F, I suppose, how would you rate the state of Kentucky and what we're doing on these child abuse cases and how we're handling them?
I would say when I first came back to the state in 2005 or 6, before our program got started, I'd probably give us a D or an F. And I think we've made a lot of strides, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. I'd say we're at a C at best, recognizing that I don't know that I would give any state in our country right now an A.
Okay, very good. Dr. Melissa Currie, keep up the good work. I know it's a tough job. I wouldn't want to do it, but keep up the good work for the kids of Kentucky.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.